Thank you so much for being here. This is one of the largest meetings that we have had, and which is wonderful. That's why we have this building to fill. The Laurie from the State Museum.
Yep.
Laurie LaBar, and she's also an author.
And I was told I get to introduce myself, so here I am. And Tuzi asked if I would look at one of your quilts. So before I actually start the talk, we're going to start, Claudia and I are going to just talk about a new quilt that's in your collection. And Claudia has some information about the family, and then I'll talk about the quilt.
This is what we call the Gower Weeks quilt because a lady by the name of Dorothy Weeks was a young bride, and her husband was John Gower. The Gower name is certainly a historic name around here, and John Gower, I believe, was the son of one of the first folks to come here. And in 1834, he married Dorothy Weeks. And in preparation for her marriage, she had made this quilt. And so the quilt is from about 18... Yes.
We can't hear over here.
Oh, sorry. I can come over here. The quilt is from 1834, the year that she was married. They had the quilt for several years, and then they went to Illinois. So the quilt left and went to, I believe it was Illinois, and then it eventually ended up in Wisconsin about 3 generations or more later. And no one really, I guess, wanted the quilt anymore. So a lady contacted us. She was a Gower. Her name was Martha Gower. And she contacted us and asked if we would like to have it. And we of course said yes. And they were coming back on a vacation. And so they brought it to us and gave us a story about the people who had originally owned the quilt and a whole family history of the Gower family. So we have not only the quilt, but the family history that goes with it. We're really pleased about that. And now Laurie's going to tell you more about it.
So I'll tell you a little bit about myself too. I'm the chief curator of the Maine State Museum. In my previous life, I was a prehistoric archaeologist, so I worked with Ellie, and of course I know Steve from those days. And then I went to the dark side. I went to the side of history as opposed to prehistory. But no, I love them both still, and I continue to do prehistoric archaeology for many years. But so what prehistoric archaeology does, in fact, prepare any kind of archaeology prepares you for becoming a curator, because you have objects and you're trying to make sense of objects and you're trying to tell stories from those objects. One thing that being a curator does is it makes you very cynical. So I don't believe any family stories until I see the evidence. And so the good news is that Tuzi asked me to look at this quilt. I had no idea if I was seeing a crazy quilt or a quilt from the 30s. I had no idea what it was. But so we opened the box and I'm like, ooh, 1830s whole cloth quilt. And sure enough, the family history jibes with what I'm seeing from it stylistically. So this is called a whole cloth quilt, but it's really from 3 pieces of fabric. There's 2 seams right here. The family says that it was made of wool that was raised and spun and woven by the family, and the linen was raised and spun by the family. Well, the linen might have been spun by the family, but they didn't use it in this quilt. It's all wool. The front and the back are wool. As often happened, so is the batting inside. As often happened, there is a patch here. Old household woolens often got used on the backs of quilts. They weren't going to show. They patch them up and use them. I'm bellowing. Everybody hear me? Okay, good. So this is called a whole cloth quilt. Whole cloth quilts kind of lost their popularity in places like Massachusetts. by the 1820s. But here in Maine, they lasted a little longer. I think for one thing, it was colder here, thank you very much. For another thing, we had a lot of wool. And for another thing, there was this pesky little problem, excuse me, sorry about that, called the War of 1812. And the War of 1812 affected Maine a lot. The embargoes that President Jefferson set really hurt Mainers and the trade that we had, and it meant that we had an economic depression in Maine. And it was really hard to get cotton to make anything from, because the two major players in the cotton industry at the time were England, we were with war with England, and France, and there were all these privateers intercepting and seizing ships. So it was pretty dicey to go to France. It was really hard to get cotton. And we wound up using a lot of wool in our quilts, longer than other places we might have otherwise. So another thing that's kind of interesting is that by the 1830s, we've gone through the federal period, we're getting right into the empire period. But this quilt still has some Baroque influences. And in the decoration that women were putting on their quilts, that's like the only place in the house where you still have this Baroque decoration is on the bed. Your furniture might have those lovely little legs, but boy, in bed, you've still got these big swirls of feathers and that kind of thing. And interestingly, you can see them on the drops, the side, the bottom, other side. You see this big hollow space. We call it cut corners, but really we should call it a four-poster bed quilt, because these are not there because there were bed posts. And if you cut those corners out, then everything folds very nicely. It's much easier to make the bed. So these are called then the drops. A couple things that I've noticed about this quilt. One is that it was not professionally woven. But I say that professional weaving was still done inside the home on hand looms at that point. But I'm not seeing, and this is actually, the yarn is very fine. It's very nicely done. It's not overspun like you sometimes see with woven. Sometimes you'll see, check the back. Nope. Sometimes you'll see they've spun too much and the texture is kind of wiggly because the yarn has too much twist to it, and that's not the case here. It's incredibly finely spun. The weaving is very nice, but I do notice a couple things. One is that somebody who was not as skilled did some of the weaving. And so we have weft threads. Remember, a warp goes up and down, right? And the weft goes from weft to right. So anytime you can't remember it, that's how that works. So I'm seeing that there are some areas where the weft is floating. So that what happens is the fibers, that when you're weaving, hand weaving, the fibers of the wool kind of stick a little bit on the warp, and sometimes your shuttle won't go through smoothly. And this person just wasn't worried about that. In the middle, it's very well done, but on the sides, this is somebody who is not as skilled. So we have our feathers. This is a little bit more, on the surface of things, it looks a little bit more maybe federal or something. It's not as flowery, but it's also a very ancient kind of design. Let's see. Talked about the front, talked about the back, talked about the design. So this may have been made in around 1833, 1834 in preparation for her wedding, indeed. But we can't say for sure because it doesn't say. So the only thing we have to go on, excuse me, I'm getting my water. The only thing we have to go on in terms of the date is the style of the quilt and the fact that there was a wedding at the time. That's pretty good, but it's not. I'm so sorry about the coughing. It's allergy time, and this is what I do. Yes, so anyway, what else can I say? Oh, I was going to say about why I think it was not professionally woven. So if they're buying wool from England, for example, what they're going to be buying is they're going to be buying something that has been what they call calendared. I'm so sorry. I'm going to drink some more water and stop bellowing. So calendaring, and you don't spell it like you spell it like a calendar with an AR. It's an ER on the end. Your computer will not like you, but it's how you spell it. So what happens with that is you dampen the wool. The wool's been dyed. You dampen this dyed wool, and you fold it and you press it through heated metal or heated wool rollers, kind of like a wringer washing machine. I mean, you put a lot of pressure on them. And what happens is it smooths the wool. Wool is a fiber that's made of lots of little scales in the shape of little cups that go one over the other. And as all of us know, to our regret, at some point in our life, when wool gets hot, sudsy water, when it goes in hot, sudsy water, those fibers open up. And then when it gets cold again, they close up again. And they'll close up on anything that moves, which is how things shrink. So that's why you shrank your sweaters, because of the nature of wool. But that's also how you calendar wool. And you can always see there'll be a seam that just will not get out because it's been essentially ironed. So that, and then the other thing is, because the fibers have opened up a little bit of dye has come out, and they've gone to the edges. And so you'll have, not only will there be this seam that you can't, this fold that just won't come out, it'll be darker there. And shameless self-promotion time, you can see a few of these quilts in here that have been calendared and what it's done to the fabrics. So if somebody wants to come up and look afterwards, you can see that there's some seams that are darker that don't have anything to do with, like, why is there this fold in the middle, and that's why. So that's why I think it was homespun, home woven, is that there's these errors and it's not calendared. So I don't know what else I can add to that, but it's a fabulous, fabulous quilt. And yes?
You mentioned early on that there was wool and linen, and then you said there was
No. The family said there was linen. There is no linen.
Was there a prohibition generally with the linen and the wool combination?
Nope. No, it was used sometimes. Not as often as we think it was. The whole sort of idea of linsey woolsey is really a sort of a romantic idea that it's got a fabulous name, it rolls off the tongue, and they kind of had this idea that back in ye olde times people made linsey woolsey quilts, and sometimes they did, but most of the time it was just straight up wool. Straight up wool. Somebody else have a question? Okay, well then I will get to talking about Maine Quilts. So this was all supposed to happen in 2020. And some of you, we can turn off the lights if you'd be so kind. So as some of you remember, see if I can walk in front of my screen for the entire talk. As some of you remember, something happened in 2020. So this wonderfully timed book was coming out in, I don't know, March. And the exhibit was going to open in July, and instead all hell broke loose, and Down East didn't publish any books that year. So Maine Quilts happened, and then, and I'll talk about this after the talk, and then at the Maine State Museum we were closed for a couple months because of COVID, and then our heating and cooling system died, and it had been dying by degrees, getting repaired every 2 weeks. And finally, it died in a room, a mechanical room that had asbestos problems. And nobody could do anything about it, and we had to close the entire building. The museum had to close, the library had to close, the archive had to close. The building is still closed. The book came out in 2021, and the exhibit will open in 2025, which is when our museum will reopen, and I'll talk about that later. So. Anyway, so this was all supposed to happen all at one fell swoop, and instead we're doing it by degrees. So when I look at quilts, there's a couple things that people inevitably ask me, and one is, what's your oldest quilt? So the oldest quilt in the Maine State Museum's collection is this one. The fabric, there's two fabrics, and because I don't have a pointer, because I forgot that I'll use my hand. So this is a block print, and this is the block print all around. And then this is something called copper engraved printing. And if any of you have seen a broadside that has an engraving on it, It's the same technique. An engraver would use a graver. This was definitely they didn't have a lot of imagination and terminology there. So an engraver would use a graver to engrave a picture, and instead of using an ink like a broadside you would for printing, in 1756, some very bright Irish lads figured out how to use dye, what kind of formulas to use for dye, and be able to dye fabric with it. And they sent the technology off to London where it went bananas. So that is called copperplate printing. And those of you who are paying attention will notice that this building is upside down, and so is that tree, and so is that eagle, and gosh, everything's upside down. I'll tell you why. Do you see this label here? It's right side up, right down there. That's right side up. So this family oriented this quilt this way. And I'll tell you why. It's one of the things that's fun about learning. I'm sure you guys have all experienced this. Learning about our objects from the past and realizing that we don't approach objects the same way we used to. We don't see things the same way we used to. So now we will put that quilt, this quilt, on a wall. And the bed, the foot of the quilt is at the bottom, and we're looking up toward the pillows of the quilt if it were oriented on a bed, right? But in those days, that would be absurd. Who would put a quilt on a wall? You put it on the bed. And the audience is not somebody standing on the floor looking at the wall. The audience is someone lying in the bed. So now look at that again and think, if your head is up at the top and you're looking down, that's all right side up. So that's my fun little, everything's upside down. No, it's not moment. So that's our oldest quilt in the collection.
How old is it?
Oh yeah, would you like the point of that whole conversation? Sure, I'll give it to you. So the fabric, this dark brown, which is almost purple, that block print was made around 1750. We have so few quilts in our collection that have anything to do with the 1700s that when I start to talk about the date of a quilt, the word 18 comes out of my mouth before I can stop it. 1750s for the brown, darker fabric, and for this copperplate engraved printed fabric, that was probably the 1770s. And my hunch is that it's recycled from bed hangings. And so it probably dates to, I'm going to say 1790 to 1800, but that's just my guess. And the early quilts in our collection, and anywhere in Maine, only, yes, I have to update this. Another is an introduction to the numbers. So you see the red quilt in the upper left-hand corner down below, there's a 3-part number. That quilt came in 1970. I think you guys use the Historical Society uses the same numbering system that we do, which is to use a 3-part. The first one is the year, the second part is whatever lot, this was the 110th bunch of stuff to come in, and this was the first one in that lot. And then on the right, where it says private, that's no longer private. That belonged to a collector who died 3 weeks ago, and that came to the Maine State Museum in the bequest. And that's the oldest dated quilt. So that's, no, where's my finger? This one is the oldest dated Maine quilt that I know about. And it's dated, it's directly dated 1804. And the person has her initials on there and then the number 4. So I'm guessing this might have been her 4th quilt. So, and this one, the red one and the big quilting design, those are the same quilts. So you can I don't know if you can see it, you might. There might be just enough light here to see in this one, let me see if I can get in here. I don't know if I can do this. This might be a really bad idea. Can you see like these dark lines here? And then there's some dark horizontals there. Yes. That's the result of calendaring. That's calendaring scars. And this is the quilting diagram for that quilt. So as you can see, it's much fancier in terms of its layout, much more Baroque than your quilt. And it's kind of unusual in that part. And what I love about this is another one that has the audience is whoever's in the bed, because up at the tippy top in the center You can see it's upside down. The second row says Rachel Chapman, and then it says October, and then it says 2THE. And then it says 1838. So that's another contemporary quilt to yours. But I love the fact that it says October tooth. And so I'm not sure if she forgot to put, and it's quilted, so I don't know if she forgot to quilt the 1 and it's supposed to be October 12th, or if she just put the TH because that's the most common one. And then when she got there, she said, oh, well, it's the 2. I'm just not going to worry about it. So, but one of my point with both of these is that in 1790, the percentage of Euro-American settlers in Maine who were of British, or were either born in Great Britain or were of British descent was over 95%. And if you add the Irish in there, it was over 98% of the Euro-American settlers in Maine. So it's not really a surprise, excuse me, that our early quilts reflect British quilting patterns, because most of the women who were making the quilts were either trained in Britain or had learned from someone who was trained in Britain. So in this case, the medallion quilt in the upper left, that's a really classic design which was very popular in Great Britain around 1800, and it falls out of fashion here, and it carries on being made in Great Britain, interestingly enough. And the same for these. This falls, we actually make, the whole cloth quilt goes out of fashion in Great Britain and then comes back, but it never really comes back here. But one of the things, which of course this tree of life pattern is one that was used from the 1600s, or I don't know, maybe even earlier, but it was a very popular form that came, polympores, very, very early Indian textiles had it, and then they just carried on making it for several hundred years. But one of the things that makes it very British is those half circle, those sort of wheels that are at the tippy top and on the sides, and at the very bottom. That's a very British thing. But one of the real subtle pieces, and one of the things that ours has that yours also does, is around this edge it has that what you call gadrooning. These little, they're like feathers, but without their whole thing. It's just these little loops. So that's a British thing. And the other thing that's very British is these extra little lines of quilting just around the outside. Yours has one, and it has a binding. This one is what they call knife edge. So yours has a binding. It's like this, and somebody's put an extra piece of fabric over that edge. This one, the front and the back, fold over, and then they're sewn. And in that case, there's the 2 extra lines. So that's just a very British thing. Oops, pointing to the wrong thing. Hello? Oh, heck, I think it's because I touched this. There we go. So what happens in the late 1700s? Well, there's a lot of revolution going on, as we recall. We have the American Revolution, of course, and we also have the Industrial Revolution. And within the Industrial Revolution, there's a whole revolution in print technology that has big ramifications for not just quilts, but clothing as well. But I'm going to be focusing on quilts. So here's our old friend that has the 2 different types of printing. So it has as I mentioned before, it has the block printing. Now, every one of those colors needs a separate block. And sometimes the printers decided that you had the background, you had the flowers, you had the leaves, but you don't have green, you have yellow, and you have blue, and it's just too expensive to make another one. So we'll just have somebody paint on the extra color. So we'll print it in yellow and paint it in blue, or vice versa. And because for some logic, there's some sort of logic that evades me, and it's called penciling, even though it's painting. So that's sometimes, so the white in this second quilt, that's another block printed piece. So it's very time consuming. Each color has to have a separate piece. You get some nice details. And then of course our old friend with the upside down eagle, there's a ton of detail. But it's also laborious because you have a 3-foot tall piece of copper that you're having to reposition and line up and make sure it doesn't mess up and you get a continuous repeat. So every time you do a new one, you have to move the fabric, move the panel. It's quite slow. So somebody thought, some bright light thought, well, what if we turned that copper into a cylinder and found a way to feed the dye? And that's what they did. So these bright, boingy colors on this quilt, there's 2 different prints, colors that we would never put together today. I love the 1830s. The 1830s, I think of them, if you want to think about the colorways of the 1830s. Colorways of the 1820s are some lovely pastels, lots of pinks, lots of kind of pale blues, beautiful sort of seafoamy colors or something, lots of light browns, very, very pretty, very delicate. And then the 1830s comes along and it's sort of like 1970, you know? Color combinations that you're really not sure about today, they just put all the colors in there. So we have purple and pink and blue and gold and maroon all together in a quilt, and pink, oh yeah, and pink, a different pink, and a red, and there's some blue. So I love the 1830s. So somebody figured out how to do that, and in one pass, you could get all the colors. So all of a sudden, your fabric doesn't stop and get printed, and then move on and get printed. It just goes straight through and keeps getting printed all along. Now, the bad news is you have a very short repeat. So on the one on the upper left with the upside down eagle, you've got about a 30-inch repeat before the time for the design repeats. And here you can see it's quite short, about 12 inches. In this case, it's even less because that's about I think those blocks are about 10 inches. So this is a fun quilt, again, not believing family histories, right? Upper left, you can't believe the family history. It says it was from North Troy, East Troy. East Troy didn't exist when this quilt was made. So the family was there a long time. Probably somebody brought it to East Troy. This quilt, ordinarily if I looked at this quilt, I would say, well, you know, I'm not an expert on block printed fabrics. I'm so sorry, from England and France, especially early ones, but I would have guessed maybe 1780s on that fabric. But the family story is that it was from a wedding gown from 1750 or 1751. And it was Hannah Libby from Saco. And so I'm like, well, let's see about that. I'm like, Hannah Libby, Saco, 17. Turns out there were 7 of them. The family just kept naming people Hannah. So the first Hannah Libby, I'm guessing she was an exceptional person because everybody named a kid Hannah. But there was a Hannah Libby who did get married in 1751, so the story may be true. So here's some more revolutionary things. One of the fun side effects, of course, of having a more efficient print technology is that the cost of printing means that the cost of printing goes down, therefore the cost of fabrics goes down. Therefore, you can buy more fabric, right? Isn't that how fabric works? Still works that way today, doesn't it? So one of the side effects is that people use a lot of different prints in their quilts after around 1830. So this 1830s here and here as well. These fabrics are all new, and there are dozens of them. This is from 1844, and it's actually, there's a lot of reused fabrics. And one of the fun things, which you can't see in this picture, but when you see the quilt and when you see the close-ups, you can see how pieces are sewn together, and on the left side, it is pretty worn out, and on the right side, the fabric is nice and new. And so you know you're dealing with a recycled fabric, because if it weathered, you know, if it degraded while it was part of the quilt, they would have degraded the same. You wouldn't have something faded right next to something bright on a seam. You would not have that. So you can tell that it was recycled. So that one's from That one's recycled. And then up on the left is another, what I was talking about with the War of 1812 and all that. That may be the reason that we were still making a lot of wool quilts in the 1830s. And this is from the same family. The quilt on the upper left is from the same family as this quilt with the ruffle. So I call this the Sunday go to meeting quilt. And I call this the everyday quilt because this quilt was used. And as you can probably tell from the left side is pretty bright compared to the right side. You see how it's a little bit faded? So the window was in that corner, and then the bottom was in the shade the most, and that's the most bright. So think about this quilt, again, with colors in the 30s. This was turquoise, dark green, bright orange, and black when it was new. It was pretty darn boingy. So that's what happens when you get a lot of technology. So Euro-Americans were not the only people in Maine. And the Wabanakis were also making what I think of as the most exquisite applique work I have ever seen. So this panel, this white band here goes vertically, that is a strand of beads. This and these, those are silk ribbon applique, and they are finer than a strand of beads. So somebody before electricity, who didn't have a magnifying glass, was cutting silk ribbons into pieces that were about 1/8 of an inch thick, and then turning 1/8 of an inch wide, and then turning both sides under and sewing them down until they were about 1/16 of an inch wide. This stuff is amazing. So these are 3 pieces, or 5 pieces, depending on how you want to count them, from the Maine State Museum's collection. In the upper left, those are cradle board wrappers. And I don't know if you can tell, but this is a painting for, oops, I keep trying to go on the screen. So this is a painting, from 1817, during the War of 1812. Those are British soldiers in red coats on the outside there. And this is the daughter of the Passamaquoddy chief. Her name was Denny Sakabason. And down at her feet, there's what looks like a doll on in the cradle board. And that's actually, remember, this is folk art. Folk artists don't always get the proportions right. That's actually a baby wrapped in a cradle board. So these are like swaddling clothes, if you want to think of them that way. Because, and a cradle board is kind of like a baby Bjorn, but you wear it on your back. And so it's the same idea. Keep the baby warm and comfortable and close. And those are black wool, and then they have silk embroidery, silk applique on them. The first ones I showed you, those are from mid-century, mid-1800s. Oh, and these did not, the cradleboard wrappers did not belong to Denny Sakabason so far as we know. I just wanted to show you how it would have been used. Now, the guy in the photograph, Francis Stanislaus, he is wearing a set of collar, cuffs, and some bands and some leggings. The photo was taken in 1890. And the style of those collars and cuffs was from easily 1850 or so. So the stuff that he's wearing is couple generations older than he is. But the Penobscots were smart folks. They still are, a lot of them, and just like us, and who aren't Penobscots. And the Penobscots did what the other tribes, local tribes, didn't really do too much of, which is that they spent so much time making these elaborate collars that rather than incorporate them into an existing coat, they were like, no. What if he gets fatter? What if he has to get a new, do people get wider when they get middle-aged? Some do, yes. And what if he has to get a new coat? What if it gets eaten by moths? All those things. So the collar that Francis is wearing took at least 300 hours to make. And I know that because a replica of an early collar like this took the artisan over 300 hours to make. And Jennifer was using ribbons that had already been bound. She didn't have to turn them under. So it probably took more like 500 hours to make. So I think it's the most sensible thing in the world to make this be something that can come off and get put on a new coat. And that way it could get handed down generations as well. So when we first saw this, I was with Jennifer Neptune and Donald Soktoma, who's the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Passamaquoddies. And we were like, wait a minute, those look so much alike. So then we got out the, we really looked very closely at it, and it turns out that those two pieces are not the same. But I will put money on them having been made by the same person, because they are almost identical. It's just a matter of some of the places where there's green on one, there's yellow on another, but the overall designs are very, very similar. So it's really unusual to be able to tell somebody that this was from the Stanislaus family. That is unheard of, to be able to do that, because so much has been lost. It's the same is true with quilts in general, but Wabanaki artists, they weren't valued, just like quilters weren't valued. It's really unusual to be able to know who made a quilt, and it's definitely unusual to know who made a piece of Wabanaki applique. And then we actually have one in our collections, and it's the upper right-hand corner. And the woman's name was Marie Pelagie, or Molly Pelagie. And she went by the name of Molly Molasses. That's what everyone knew her as. And she probably made that peaked cap in the 1790s when she was a girl. And she's wearing it in this picture in the 1860s. And so we have the cap, and we have a picture of the woman wearing the cap. And that is very, very precious. It's really unusual to be able to have that. So I just wanted to show you what was going on in the Wabanaki community. People were making applique that was far and away more skilled and delicate than anything the Euro-American community was making. But they were also making applique using European trade goods. They were making objects that were absolutely Wabanaki. And I am very, very fond of them. I could talk all night about that, but that's not why okay, I'll change my subject. So that brings us up to the 1840s. And in the 1840s, there was this huge fad of making album quilts. I'm sure you have some album quilts in the collection here. They were all the thing. And the fad started down in the mid-Atlantic in Maryland. And some of us may have heard of Baltimore album quilts. And the thing about Baltimore album quilts is they're very complex. It looked like they're just sort of made, like somebody actually organized it, And so the colors are similar, the styles are similar. And then you get to Maine, and it is amateur hour. It is just, it doesn't look, the one on the lower right actually looks a little bit like somebody planned it. We have a medallion. Here's our old friend, the medallion quilt. We have, here's a cross, here's 4 roses in the corner, here's these guys. So somebody actually planned that out, and then everything breaks down once you get further, but somebody actually did plan the middle of this quilt. And then the one on the left is far more typical Maine, which is that everybody does their own thing, and then somebody puts it together, and hey, it looks okay. But let's move on to this next picture. One of the things that I love about album quilts, of course, is that there's some wonderful folk art, and this is one of them. And then there's names on them, which is really a nice little cheat sheet. You can learn about the community. Who made this quilt? And what does it mean? Why did they make this quilt? A lot of times you can't answer that question, but sometimes you can. So this block, this wonderful fishing vessel with these gigantoid fish. They're bigger than the dinghy. He was going to have a great day. And it's inscribed, and there's a stamp here with a name. And the name is George Lovett. Now, Lovett was a fisherman and a fish merchant, fish broker, if you will, in Portland. This quilt is from, actually both of these quilts are from Cape Elizabeth, and this is 1846, and I'll get to this one, that was around 1861.
There's a lot of Lovetts in Gorham.
Yep. Well, George Lovett, we know who he was, but I don't know if any of you have ever known any fishermen in Maine, lobstermen, fishermen in Maine. If any of you have ever had the experience, which I am proud to have had, of going to a contra dance on Deer Isle and holding hands with some of these guys, they have hands like catcher's mitts. You know, they are in this ice cold water all year round. And I will put money on the fact that a guy did not do that. One of these fishermen did not do that. He would not have had the dexterity to do this delicate embroidery and applique work. But his wife did make a block on this quilt, so it was probably his wife that did it. So that's one thing to kind of think about when you are looking at a quilt, is just because there's a name on the block, it doesn't necessarily mean that that person made it. And sometimes the person with the best handwriting wrote all of them. Those are called, so we call those inscribed quilts. This is inscribed. There's a quilt in our collection that one of the blocks has two girls' names on it. They were twins, and they were two. They didn't make that block. Didn't make it. So here's the later one. And just be with me a second. So this one is from the same community, and it doesn't have any dates on it. So the nice thing about album quilts is you don't have to do what I did with the Sunday Go to Meeting quilt from Sacco and really look at the fabric and figure out when the fabric was made and when people got married. You can actually work with people's names. So I'm going to read just a little bit from the book. So this is how folk art dated this quilt. Detective work dated this quilt from the folk art of it. So Angela Emery dated Richard Lee Jr. on March 3rd, 1854. Her married name appears on her quilt block. Valera Jane Smart married John Murch on August 28th, 1859. Her maiden name is on her quilt block. Together, these wedding dates imply that the quilt was made between the spring of 1854 and the fall of 1859. Quilts take time to make, however, and some blocks are finished earlier than others. Clues on another block might move the completion date later. That block is decorated with an image of the Portland Breakwater Lighthouse. The half-mile-long breakwater was completed in 1837. Officials constructed a wooden lighthouse at the end of it in 1855. That's within our dates. We're trying to figure out how old this quilt is. William Lee Willard of Cape Elizabeth was the second keeper of the lighthouse. I don't know if you can see this, but it says WLW. He served from June of 1857, also within our range, until his death in February 1860 of a tumor. So he was 26 years old. So that could move, if this is done in his memory, that could move our quilt date a little later. His older brother, Benjamin F. Willard Jr., took over care of the lighthouse until a new keeper could be found. In 1861, Benjamin and his wife, Hannah Ann Stanley Emery Willard, had a baby whom they named after Benjamin's deceased brother. So for this quilt, I've said it's late, it could have been made in 1861 because we don't know, is this block made to honor Willard's death or young Willard's birth? We don't know. And sometimes quilt research can save the day. We like that, right? So this was given to us, as you can see from wherever it is. Here it is, 1970. And in 1970, it was hard to do genealogical research. It was a lot of leg. Some of you may remember trying to do that kind of research before Ancestry.com. It was a lot of work. So this came to us, and they said that the people who gave it to us said that it was probably from South Bristol. And there were two names they had found. And one was buried in South Bristol, and one was buried in Round Pond, also on that peninsula. But the names were sort of names that, they're not that unusual. Like one of them was Susan Clark. She's the one from South Bristol. Well, I was having no luck. We had no luck finding any of these other names. And in the fall of 2019 and the winter of 2020, I was just having a bear. I could not find, having a bear of a time because I couldn't find the other names. And then COVID hit. I sent the okay to print, having looked at the last batch of proofs. I sent the okay to print on a Monday, and that was the same day that the entire publishing house closed for a temporary layoff. So it took me weeks to find out that, we weren't going to be printing a book this year. And I said, well, if that's the case, I'm just going to do a little bit more research because, we can change things later on maybe a bit. So, that I hadn't done any work on this quilt for about 6 months. And I decided I was going to look it up again. So the upper right, this is the block. Where is it? Here. There's a detail shot. And as you can see, it's got that pesky. A lot of you who've looked at quilts from the 1800s, middle 1800s, notice that the browns are falling apart. And it's because the mordant they used had a lot of iron in it, and it dissolves the cotton. Eats away at the cotton over the years. Eats away is probably a better word than dissolve. Anyway, it trashes it. How's that? And so this is in very poor condition. And then it had been washed in the past. So we had this, it was so hard to read this name. And so in our records, it said her name was Triphonia Handlet. So once again, I typed Triphonia Handlet into Ancestry, and this time it comes up, do you mean Tryphosa Hoodlet? Why, yes, as a matter of fact, I do mean Tryphosa Hoodlet. They'd had an upgrade, and oh my gosh, I found my quilt. So once I found Tryphosa Hoodlet, and I pronounced her name wrong for months before I was corrected because it's Hoodlet, not Howdlet. So once I found Tryphosa, I found everybody else. And everybody was from, all but one person was from Dresden, and that other person was just over the line in Pittston. So we finally had the community, and I live in Dresden, so I was doing, it's COVID time, so we were doing things like saying, what do you want to do? Let's go to a graveyard, and we'd go to a cemetery, and I'd be looking for these names, and I'd be like, I found your quilt. It was so exciting. So quilt research saved the day. Yay, Tryphosa. All for any of you who have named your child something weird and random, God bless you. So one of the things which I didn't really talk about album quilts, is that they're made by groups of people, usually almost inevitably groups of women. And a lot of these women were bound together by interests that were beyond just themselves. Some of these quilts were given to a minister who was leaving the community or something like that. But a lot of times also these would be groups of women who were sort of activist groups. They were women who were united by their opposition to slavery or their devotion to temperance, for example. And this brings us to the Civil War, actually, because this was the time that those women's groups that had been getting together and making these quilts for a couple of decades now, this was their time to shine because they had been in training for this their whole existence. So women's groups got together and did a lot of quilts, did a lot of fundraising. They made quilts for hospitals. They auctioned quilts to raise money for the Union or for the Confederacy, depending on where they were. Individual women also made quilts. The one on the left was made by a woman from Jay, 1864. None of her children were in the war. Her husband was too old, her children were too young. But her devotion to the Union is unquestioned. On the right, excuse me, we were trying to figure out what did this group of women have in common. And a colleague of mine, curator at the New England Quilt Museum, Pam Weeks, oh gosh, I forgot something. Hang on, hold that thought. I want to go back to this quilt and the technique that has been used to make it. Do you see these little seams here? This is binding and a seam. So today we call this potholder quilts. That's not what they called them then, but we call them potholder quilts because each block is finished quilted, bound, and you get a stack of them, and it's like a stack of little pot holders. And then you whip stitch them together on the back, and you have a quilt. So this is a pot holder quilt. And this is an example of what can go wrong and why people don't like to do pot holder quilts. Who here has done a group quilt, an album quilt or a friendship quilt or a sampler quilt? Anybody? I see a few hands going off. Okay. Tell me if I'm wrong. There's always one. You say, we're going to make a quilt, and all of the blocks are going to be 11 inches square finished. And there's always one that says, oh, I thought you meant 11 inches and then you turn it under, and hers is too small. Or you get people who say, oh, I thought you said 12 inches. There's always someone. And boy, there was more than one someone making this quilt. So right here, I don't know if you can see, but like this one is taller than the others. This one's wider than the others. So are these. Those are the same extra width. Right here, those corners do not, they just do not line up. And down here, we got a pucker. This is what, and the whole thing, when it's hanging, it will not lie flat. The whole thing has this sort of ripple as it hangs on the wall because nothing's the right size. I mean, somebody apparently said, oh, let's do it about 11 inches or something like that. So that said, here's another question. Who here is familiar with the book Big House, Little House, Back House, Barn? Okay, a few hands go up. So that's about the connected farm buildings of New England, right? And we've all seen them. You've got your house, and then you've got a smaller house, and then you've got like the woodshed, and then there's the barn. And the center for these, there's some in Vermont, there's some in New Hampshire, there's a couple in Massachusetts. But the epicenter of that is in Maine, around the Litchfield area, apparently. So it's definitely, this is the place where there are the most of them. And the same is true of potholder quilts. Yes, there are some elsewhere, but most of them are from Maine, and then there's a bunch more that are from Massachusetts, but let's face it, Maine and Massachusetts are pretty closely related because we didn't get our freedom from Massachusetts till 1820. Am I biased? Why, yes, I am, thanks. So, so that, anyway, that is, if someone's saying, how can you tell a Maine quilt? That's one way you can tell a Maine quilt, is if all you have is it's a pot holder, you can't say, yes, this is a Maine quilt. But if you have a pot holder and it's later in the 1800s, like mid-1800s, and you still have these cut corners, that's also a real Maine thing. Mainers, a lot of Mainers put cut corners on quilts until the turn of the century, the 20th century. We have some that are sort of 1890 to 1895 that still have cut corners. And I don't know if it's poverty, if it's thrift, if it's if it ain't broke, don't fix it, if it's some sort of conservative outlook. But people here really used their four-poster beds until they wore out, and they just didn't wear out because we built them rugged and tough. So that's another thing that it means it could be a Maine quilt. So we've got two things. We've got potholder quilt and a Maine quilt. And then, of course, there's the overall lack of any kind of design flow whatsoever to this quilt, which tells me that it could very well be a Maine quilt. So now it has three things that say Maine. And then there's the fourth one, which I really love, which is that Mainers, for a lot of Mainers, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to make a nice quilt block. You had to frame that sucker. So if you look at the top row, here is the quilt block. Here's the quilt block frame. Here is a square and a square quilt block. This person gave it two frames, the white one and the brown one. Here's the quilt. Here's the quilt block. Here's the frame around the edge. This one has, again, two frames. We have a 9-patch, which is kind of tarted up a bit, right? And then it has a brown frame, and then it has the red and white frame. This one, again, got the frame. Here I think we have 3 frames on this one, and it goes on. So half of those have frames. So framing a quilt block is a real Maine thing. It's the same type of a thing. It can't tell you, yes, this is absolutely a Maine quilt. But by the time you get 4 of those things in one quilt, this is like the quintessential Maine quilt. Okay, now I can go on. And just as this quilt can tell you why making a potholder quilt was dicey, this one on the right can tell you when it's right, when it goes really well. And I think the organizers of this quilt, instead of just saying, we need 20 of you to do blue stars and 20 of you to do red stars, and they want to be 5-point stars, and they need to be X size, I think they actually handed out the quilt block with the star already on it, so they would be in the right place and the right orientation and straight, and you'd have the right number of them. And then, because all the bindings are different, so I think they handed out and the backings are different. But I'm pretty sure that's how they handed them out, so that at least everybody had the same size block at the end. And this looks a little dirty. Don't you think it looks a little grubby? Well, the reason for that is that's not dirt, that's inscriptions. Every single block has all these little inscriptions on it. And when we were trying to find out what the makers of this quilt had in common, what was the tie that bound these people, we realized that these were all people who were either students or alumni or staff at the Portland Home Institute, which was an upper class, a school for upper class girls in Portland. And their education was very thorough, at least in literature, which is the only thing I can really vouch for. This was made in June of 1864. Some of the inscriptions that they wrote on their quilt were published in literary magazines for the first time in May of 1864. So these women are reading literary magazines, they're reading the latest literature, they're reading the newest books, the newest poetry, and they're putting it right onto their quilt. And the students from here came, a lot of them from Portland, one of them was from Richmond, Maine, and one of them was from Matanzas, Cuba. Probably, I'm going to guess her father was a captain who had ties to Maine. So after the Civil War, of course, everything changes again. And one of the things that changes is that women get sewing machines because Singer figured out if you can buy it on time, put some money down and then pay it off. He's the guy that figured that out for all of us who have car payments. He's the one that figured that out, that we can manage it if we just put some money down, we can pay some money every month. And the thing about sewing machines is that even if none of these quilts, and I don't think any of these quilts, I think all these quilts were sewn by hand in the era of the sewing machine, but that was because their dresses and their pants and their aprons and their children's diapers and all those things, those were sewn with a sewing machine. So they had time to do the quilting. And then, of course, another thing that happens is, remember I was talking about cylinder printing and how much faster it was? Well, after the war, somebody figured out you could print 12 colors at one time, 12 patterns at once, if you wanted to. That was for a very expensive fabric, but it was still that just, we were producing, what was the figure I have? I don't know if I have it on this quilt or if I have in this talk or if I have, heck no, why would I have put that important piece of information in my notes? Anyway, we were producing millions of yards. Even here in Maine, we were producing millions and millions of yards. I think it was 10,000 yards of fabric per year per employee. And they would have thousands of employees. So I believe, this is if you want to take a look at this data, the easiest place to find it is in the Maine History Atlas. It talks about how many millions of yards were made on an annual basis in Saco alone. And the mills in Saco, of course, were nothing compared to the mills in Lawrence and Lowell. So there were just millions of yards of fabric being produced, and the price was relatively lower than it had ever been. And of course, what do women do when they've got when fabric's on sale, we buy more fabric. And it was ever thus. So women in this case, they were buying it and they were trading it. And there were all kinds of very busy quilts that came as a result of this. So the piece on the upper left, again, all hand quilted. That is a lovely piece. The woman who made this quilt, she made another one almost identical to it. And she had an ankle injury. And she could not use she lost her foot essentially by the next time that the census comes around. She doesn't just have an ankle injury, she doesn't have a foot. So I think there were a lot of things she could not do on the farm, and that may have given her some more time to do some exceedingly delicate, time-consuming quilting. But she really did a lovely job. There's some new styles that come up in this time. So the lower right is called, we call it today a charm quilt, and they called it a charm quilt then as well. So every single diamond on that quilt came from a different bolt of cloth. And so one person may not have had that many pieces of fabric at her house, but she probably traded with friends. Even so, she had so many different kinds of cloth that she could actually make a pattern. So you know she had extras when she was done, because she doesn't have a lot of blues there. So my hunch is that she had a lot of extra pieces that she could have used, but just didn't find a way to make it work stylistically. These three are called postage stamp, we call them today postage stamp quilts, because that's about how big the pieces are. These pieces are about an inch square, each one of these. These were made these are the ones I was talking about that were made between 1890 and 1895. She got married around 1890. She had her first kids in 1895. I'm going to guess she made them before 1895. And the fabric is consistent with that. That's an assumption on my part that's based on the fabric. But it's always also one of those you're going, if I have to cut this off, I'm going to guess that by the time her second kid, she has 2 kids who are probably in diapers, I bet she finished it before then. This one is also postage stamp quilt, and in this case, the pieces are just a hair under an inch, and they're what we call half square triangles. Each square is made of 2 triangles, and each square is less than an inch in size. So those are things that you see this time. Lots of prints, lots of new patterns. Look at all these new patterns. And again, so the ones on the left are called Delectable Mountains. Does anybody know where that comes from? You have to be a real geek to know this one, I have to say. Okay, how many of you guys read Little Women? I don't mean saw the movie, I mean read the book. Okay, so there's a point early on when they are in the attic and they are playing Pilgrim's Progress. They're acting as though they are Christian the Pilgrim going to paradise through all of these temptations and trials and the Slough of Despond and all that kind of thing. And Delectable Mountains is one of the beautiful places where he can rest, but it's also kind of a dangerous place because maybe he won't want to go on because Delectable Mountains are so lovely. So that's from that, that's from that book is the name of this pattern, which was the person thinking about life's trials and tribulations when they made that? I don't know, but it's neat that there's a religious name to some of these new patterns. Up on the top row, those 4 are all, I'm sure some of you guys have seen log cabin quilts. Those are all different combinations. You just have to manipulate the pattern a different way, turn the block a certain way, and you get a different pattern with them, which is a lot of fun. And then the ones on the left, on the bottom row, different patterns. One of the things that these have in common is they're really fussy. There's a lot of work, there's a lot of skilled needlework that needs to happen for you to pull these off. And I'm sure you all remember this from high school chemistry class. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. That's my theory of crazy quilts, is that somebody said, I can't take this anymore. I just need to do something fun. And so we have crazy quilts. And the upper right, and these began to be popular in the 1880s, 1890s is when their big boom was. So upper right is the classic silk, lots of silk, a little bit of velvet, and Every single surface is embellished, so nothing exceeds like excess is the motto of a crazy quilt. So every single inch of that has an ornamentation on it. It's either embroidered or it's painted or there's something appliqued on it. One quilt, and it might have been that one, I counted 17 different embroidery stitches just on the seams, not in the decoration, just on the covered up the seams. In the middle is a wool quilt. Mainers had a lot of wool, what can we say? This one's a little later, and the woman lived, where did she live? She lived in the woods, and she lived, I want to say it was north and east of the Forks. So there wasn't a lot there. I can't remember the name of the town. But she also, at one point when she was younger, lived in Lewiston. And we think that either she or a family member or friend worked sewing clothing, because a lot of these are things that would be cut out when you're making pockets. And here and there, there's a placket, that kind of thing. There's pockets here again. So we think that those are wool from making, scraps from making clothing. And here the embroidery is not as detailed because wool's tough, but the embroidery is beautiful. There's just not as much of it. And then the lowest one, lower left, you know, John Mayer was the curator at the Maine Historical Society, and I have a lot of respect for John, and I was ready to kill him. I went down, and he said, "Oh, Laurie, I have to show you something. I'm really sorry. We shouldn't have taken it. It should have gone to you." And he was right, darn it. It was this quilt, because it's not from the Portland, you know, it's not even from Cumberland County. It's from Presque Isle and Caribou. So yeah, it should have come to us, what can I say? But it's stunning, and I get to borrow it, and I absolutely love this quilt. So this was made around 1912, and it's not a real crazy quilt. The lines, all the different lines of that are just embroidered on a piece of solid velvet to make it look like a crazy quilt. And the bright, bright colors. The back of it is that, see where that circle is? La la la, where am I? This circle has that bright yellow center. The back is lemon yellow satin. It's absolutely stunning. And all those bright flowers are velvety. They are scraps from millinery. They're the scraps from the flowers on women's hats. Yes, and so that brings us up to the 20th century. And as we all know, in the 20th century, what's constant is change. But there's still a lot of community. The title of the book and the title of the quilt has to do with comfort, the comfort that you have when you have a quilt, but also the ways that quilts reflect our communities. And a couple of these are community quilts. This one right down here is made up of poultry ribbons, for those of you who like to participate in, if you're ever in 4-H or anything like that. So those are all prize-winning poultry ribbons. Oh, wow. And they're all rayon, and they're very bright, and they're from like 1904 to 1909, I think. And then the quilt with the chickadees, that's actually the most recent one there. That was made in 1995, and then there's 12 of them, and it's the 12 Days of Christmas with a Maine theme. So this is 4 chickadees instead of 4 calling birds. And a group, the Clamshell Quilters of Damariscotta, a quilt group, made it and gave it to the Blaine House so that it could be used as decor at Christmas times. And then there's one thing I want you to take a look at. Upper left, lower right. Look at those lovely pastels. And then look at these colors. The colors are really different. And one of the things I talk about in my book, and I will in the exhibit as well, and I've actually talked about it a little bit already here, but I haven't said it in these words, is that politics, like economics, politics can affect the way a quilt looks too. So think back, early 1900s, and those wonderful white Edwardian outfits, right? Aren't those gorgeous? Guess what? The Germans weren't giving us any dyes. And then what happens? World War I, and we weren't getting any dyes then either, because the center of dyes were in Germany. And so, and of course, those were all gearing up to be dedicated to the war effort, not to making dyes. So yes, lovely white fabric was the fashion, but it was the fashion for a political reason as well. And so after the war, German companies gave or sold, or practically gave, sold for a dime on the dollar or less their technology for dye stuffs. And American dyers took the stage. And American dyers didn't just do what the Germans had done exactly. They learned from the German dyers. And the dyes that they used, they took into account this newfangled thing called electricity and how quilts would look, how fabrics would look under electric lights. And that's where we get that Nile green and those pastel pinks. So that's what's happening in the upper right, upper left and lower right is those new colors. They were designed, and the irony, of course, is that they come to Maine, and a lot of people in Maine don't even have electricity till the 1940s. But by golly, the stuff we make is going to look great whenever we get electricity. So there's a lot of community quilts going on, as I said, also in Maine. On the left is one that was made in 1935 and was auctioned in 1936. It was made in Phippsburg, the Phippsburg Welfare Society, and we call it the Phippsburg Song Quilt. So unlike a lot of quilts you just buy your tickets, and if you're lucky, you win the quilt. We still do this, right? Lots of us have bought tickets for quilts. This one, the song quilt, each block was a song, and to get the quilt, you had to guess the most songs and line them up with the blocks. So some of them are straightforward. I learned things. I did not know, where it is, that Tiptoe Through the Tulips was written in the 19-teens. Any of you guys know that? No, I thought it was the 1960s. Some of these are pretty straightforward. We would guess them. Here is an owl and a pussycat going to sea in a pea green boat, okay? Here's a bear going over a mountain. I bet we could get that one. Here is sidewalks with lots of people in a big cityscape. We could probably get that one. Some of the other ones, I still haven't figured out what two of them are. And I have the cheat sheet that gives you the answers, and I still can't match up some of them. So it did go back to, a local woman did win it, but she had moved to Boston. She never had any children. She brought it back and gave it to the town, gave it to a woman in the town who had lived there for 9 generations. Well, she didn't, obviously, but her family had. So I said, oh, that's amazing. Your family's been here for 9 generations? She said, yes, I think it shows a real lack of imagination. I just loved that. So she gave it to us because none of her kids wanted it. Yeah, and on the right, and so these were fundraiser quilts, and this group had been raising money for the library and the fire department, and then in the 1930s they realized that kids were going to school barefoot. And that might be okay in Alabama, but it is not going to fly in Maine. And so at that point, the group got together and decided that they were not going to raise money for community efforts as much as the money was needed as well, but to make sure that kids had shoes. And so that's what this was raised for. And then on the right, some of you may have been involved in quilts that were made for the bicentennial. This was made in Augusta, and I love it. It's, you know, these, these bicentennial quilts were all about like praising our hometowns. So they have all the important places, and I gotta figure out here we go. They have all the important places, like here's the church, here's the State House, this is Augusta after all. Here's the fire department, and the school, and then this is my favorite of all the important places that make Augusta the beautiful town that it is. Here's Mr. Market. That's my favorite. And I have a big space in between these two quilts to remind me to mention that between these two times, between the Depression and the bicentennial, quilts were really not popular. They were not cool. I'm so sorry, my allergies have just kicked in again. And I think one of the reasons, and we also have this sort of idea that quilts were made of leftover fabrics. And sometimes that's true. If you look at your quilt, the back, where it wasn't going to show, that's leftover fabric. But the front of it was new fabric. And I think a lot of it has to do with our collective memory of the Depression, where we did have to use old fabric because we simply couldn't afford any new fabric. And so at that point, it becomes, yeah, it's kind of, we don't want any of that old stuff. But the bicentennial brings it all back, and it has not stopped growing since. There's so many quilters in Maine, and whenever I bring out this slide, I have to apologize because the quilt scene today is so vibrant, and I only have one lousy slide. So I apologize to all modern quilters in Maine. But one of the things, I do have 3 slides, actually, 2 slides. But one of the things I've noticed as I've gone through all this time period, 250 years of quilts in Maine, is I can see a thread, and in some cases, traditionalists, women, there's some women who just, and I'm sorry, I keep saying women, but it's almost all women. There's only a few men who made quilts that we know of in Maine. We have one quilt out of over 150 that was made by a man, and unfortunately it's in such bad shape I can't really show it. But some women just wanted something beautiful to cover up with at night, and they wanted something that reminded them of simpler times in their lives, people they loved, and they wanted a traditional pattern to cover up with. And that's true today too. And then there's another group that you can see throughout time that are what I call neo-traditionalists. And those people use patterns from the past, and this is also a potholder quilt, or they use techniques from the past. This piece is an art quilt, but it's a whole cloth quilt, which has been, the dye has been painted on and then embroidered. And then, those are sort of neo-traditionalists. And then there's people for whom the personal expression is the most important thing. And the fact that the medium is fabric is immaterial, if you will. So the fact that it's a quilt doesn't matter as much as that it's an expression. And so actually these 3 are also, even though these are traditional techniques, these 3 are art quilts, what you would call today. In fact, the couple that made this were in the exhibit in the early 1980s that coined the term art quilt, and they live in Booth Bay. This artist lives in Hope, Bath, and this artist is in Belfast. And you say, well, but, you don't really recognize art quilts so much in the past because without really thinking about what time was this made, sometimes you can see, wow, this person was really forward thinking. And then you have quilts like this that just sort of hit you over the head with the fact that they were an art quilt. So this quilt, believe it or not, was made in the town of Alexander in 1868. The fabric was bought in St. Stephen, New Brunswick, because that was the closest place to get fabric. The woman's daughter, when she was a very old woman, wrote down and said that she remembered her mother getting leaves from the garden and from her house plants, and that was the patterns for it, for some of those patterns. Now, when you look at this, remember that, okay, here are some pears and stuff, but the leaves that are the same color as the pears, those were once bright green. These were a different kind of fabric. This was curtain fabric, and the dye stayed, but the blues faded from this. The greens faded to a tan. So think of this. This would have been, not only would have been pretty electric like it already is, but all of those sort of tans were boingy green, just bright Kelly green. So think of how boingy it was. And I sort of, in my head, I made up a little story that Peter Max when he was hobnobbing with the Beatles, and it was just so stressful and so wild, and he just needed some time, and he was he was kind of freaking out. It was so busy. So he time traveled back 100 years, and he wound up in Alexander, Maine, and here was this woman making a quilt, and he was so inspired by her sons, I don't mean her boys, I mean her sons, that he went back 100 years in the future because he was getting bored because Alexander, Maine was really too quiet. And so he went back and he made this psychedelic pop art, and he made himself into an internationally known millionaire thanks to a woman in, Maine. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Are there any questions?
Why didn't you use plants for dye the way the Lebanese were?
We did early on.
But the German connection, you said.
I don't really know much about the chemicals that got used. I really don't. But after 1862, 63, those chemical dyes became all the rage, and that was what the chemists wanted to play with. Yeah, and so other than that, I can't really tell you that. But a lot of chemists would rather do something with, you can make a million of something if you can distill it, as opposed to having to make sure that your, crop of beetles from Mexico didn't fail, that type of thing. Yes?
As a chemist, the German ones would be more stable color-wise
Yeah, that's true too.
than the natural ones.
Yeah, true. And they still faded. We still get those greens that go to tans. Oh well. But thank you. That's good to remember. I'll remember that. Anybody else? I will say one more thing, and that is I've had several people ask, and so some of you have heard this already, but how about that Maine State Museum? Ever going to open? So, for those of you who haven't heard, we're closed. I think I did mention that we had to close in 2020 because our HVAC, heating and cooling system, died in a room that had asbestos problems. That meant that the archives, state library, state museum, we all had to move out. And the state library and the state museum, state archives are open on a limited basis now, and you can go there and do things, but you need to book time ahead. We can't do that because we can't really build an exhibit that is feasible. So we are closed, and we were not able to empty everything out of the museum until last July because we didn't have enough room to put it all somewhere. And it took that long for the state to A, decide that yes, we were right, that we didn't have room, and then B, find a place for us and make it secure and make it archival and all that stuff. So they didn't do that till last July. So finally they're doing the work. So we will, if nothing else goes wrong, and lots of things have gone wrong, it's such a complex project. So they're doing the asbestos, they're doing insulation. What a concept, insulation. And because you'd think that a building that was built in the late 1960s would have insulation, right? But you'd be wrong. It didn't have any insulation. So we're thrilled that we're going to get insulation. It means that instead of having climate control that's controlled by the climate that it is outside, we'll actually have climate control, and we're really looking forward to that. So this is all going to happen, and we should get back in the building in about a year and a half. Oh, God. And then that's going to be in an empty building. So we are scrambling. We're working really hard to make sure that we have new exhibits for you to go, because let's say that your bathroom was built in 1970 and you have some sort of catastrophic failure in your bathroom, and you're not going to put the same exact fixtures back in the same exact place. They're 1970, come on, So a lot of our exhibits on that, especially on the third floor where you walk in, some of them dated to the 1970s. So we are actually changing the whole entry level where you go in. So I say this so that those of you who loved our little, our back to nature area with all the critters. It's gone. We saved the moose. We've saved the animals that we could save, we've put back into storage, but it was to the point where the birds were self-destructing. We would go downstairs and there would be little cardinal feet and a pile of feathers. So we had to do something, and I'm probably exaggerating about the cardinal, but not really. I'm pretty sure that's how we lost a couple of chickadees. So anyway, it needed a lot, and we're changing the game. There'll be 2 whale skeletons there instead, and we'll be talking about the Gulf of Maine. And then we're going to have an education center on that floor where agriculture and granite and ice are all now going to be an education center, which has all kinds of natural history things in it, as well as the Bryant Pond switchboard, all kinds of neat stuff, really geared toward kids and how kids learn. And then when you go in, there'll be a new exhibit called Meet Maine here. And the quilt exhibit will be our first temporary exhibit when we reopen, and that will also be in 2025. So I hope you all come back, and please forgive us for being closed for so long, and just come back. Any other questions? I hope I didn't talk too long.
No, Laurie.
Watch your step.
So much.
You're welcome.